Bitcoin is an idea. It's spiritual. It's written into a database, but that as well is not tangible. There's no one location that Bitcoin is in. It is everywhere that it needs to be, everywhere that anybody wants it to be. Right? If you run a node, all the Bitcoin, not just your Bitcoin, all the Bitcoin is there. Bitcoin is more like a technological revolution than a violent overthrow of government. And what happens in those technological revolutions is the incumbents try to resist the technology, but then end up getting left behind as it becomes adopted. They first serve the people who are overserved and unable to be served by the incumbent technology. It's all the people who are unbanked who can see the real currency advantages of Bitcoin. I don't know anyone who would die over Microsoft Word or Google Chrome, but people are prepared to fight to defend their right to run Bitcoin.
You describe Bitcoin as spiritual money. What do you mean by that?
Well, we can go really deep into it. Just at the very high level of the surface, there's the spiritual world and the material world, right? And maybe people divide it in other ways, but gold is physical money. It's material money. Bitcoin is an idea. It's spiritual. It's written into a database, but that as well is not tangible. There's no one location that Bitcoin is in. It is everywhere that it needs to be, everywhere that anybody wants it to be. Right? If you run a node, all the Bitcoin, not just your Bitcoin, all the Bitcoin is there, and it's not there. It's there because we believe in it, because we understand the system and how it works, and because it then, if we go a little bit deeper, it has a spirit behind it. The spirit of Bitcoin is this idea that money should not be stolen, that money that you've earned is yours, that you can even know enough about what the money is, that you can verify it yourself, that the fraud is eliminated from it, seizure is eliminated from it, uncertainty about its supply is eliminated from it. This is a very powerful idea that's behind Bitcoin, and it becomes a spiritual thing for so many people who become invested in and involved in Bitcoin. Like they're behind Bitcoin. There are people who would, fight with their lives for the right to run this piece of software. That's a lot more important than I don't know anyone who would die over Microsoft Word or Google Chrome, but people are prepared to fight, to fight to defend their right to run Bitcoin. So there's a spirit in this thing that's a spirit of rights, of purpose, of life. And those are some of the, very quick and introductory ideas when I talk about Bitcoin as a spiritual form of money.
Why do you think Bitcoin goes so deep? Because it's interesting. Like in the end of the day, like we could say like, oh, it's just money and it's a tool we can use the same way as we use fiat or anything else, the same way as we use gold. But why do you think Bitcoin runs so much deeper and we tattoo Satoshi symbols on our things and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of reasons. One is it's solving a really big problem that a lot of people, when they realize how big the problem is, it stirs their spirit, right? It's like, this is really important. This is vitally important, and it's irreplaceable. We live in a civilization where everybody specializes, and so because you specialize, what you produce isn't necessarily valuable to anyone and everyone at every period in time. So we need money. And then when we find out that our money is badly broken and is filled with deceit and that it gets deflated, it's like, well, all the time and energy that you put into creating value, the thing that you receive in exchange for it, is leaking time and energy on you constantly. And when you actually find, and you haven't been told that your whole life. So there's a giant sense, when you discover this is true about fiat money, you feel a giant sense of betrayal, right? Because the issuer of the money is the entity, the government, that had been telling you all your life, don't worry, we'll take care of you, just pay your taxes and this and that and the other. And then you find out that there's a giant betrayal. And there's many other giant betrayals too, but Bitcoin is this fix to this giant betrayal. And it doesn't say we're going to get the government to behave better. It says we're going to take the government out of the thing. And I think that is one of the big awakenings that people have, and say, if I can take personal responsibility and be a sovereign and independent individual, I can work with other sovereign and independent individuals to keep and earn what it is that we want to work on, and not to be subject, slaves, underlings, whatever the term that people have. So it becomes a very powerful idea. If you view yourself as having been stolen from or having been enslaved, and you find a path to freedom, it's a revolution. It's a revolutionary technology. And then you get overwhelmed by saying, well, revolutions are really hard to have, and they're really bloody, and and they're filled with violence and death. And this is a peaceful revolution. All I have to do is run a piece of software and try to teach as many people as I can about it. I don't gain anything by spilling any blood, and nobody gains anything by spilling my blood. So it's within the realm of ideas. And again, it's another form of it's a spiritual revolution, or around what money can be and ought to be, and what our responsibilities are for that, what it can be and ought to be.
Is that the first peaceful revolution of that kind, or is there something in the past or history that we can compare it to?
I think it depends on how you define revolution. Like if you say the Industrial Revolution was a revolution of the same sort, where people went from producing a whole thing to working in a factory and turning a crank or a screw, and the scale of production went up dramatically, and you call that a revolution. It's kind of like a technological revolution. Well, that revolution is generally bloodless too, right? Like, people were injured at work, and there may have been businessmen who killed other businessmen, but it wasn't like there was a bloody revolution to overthrow the previous regime. So we've seen a lot of this disruptive technological revolutions. We've seen maybe 5 or 6 giant phases of that happen. I think Bitcoin is a unique one because what makes Bitcoin unique as a revolution is it is a revolution that's replacing a very large function of the government. So it does qualify as that political revolution. And we've never seen peaceful political revolutions before, unless you just view every election in a democracy as a peaceful transition of power. But this is a taking away of power from the government, not putting somebody else in charge of government. So that's a really powerful distinction.
Super interesting. But it's the peaceful revolution in Bitcoin, like till now, it was completely peaceful. I'm just wondering what the pushback from the current, like every revolution is going somewhere, and every revolution is revolutionizing something. And like big governments and central banks are kind of the opposing sides to Bitcoin, if you will. So, what do you expect in the transition to a more Bitcoinized world? The pushback from them will be, and it will continue to be completely peaceful in that regard?
Listen, it's a good question. No one has a perfect crystal ball, but I think this is where Bitcoin is more like a technological revolution than a violent overthrow of government. And what happens in those technological revolutions is the incumbents try to resist the technology, but then end up getting left behind as it becomes adopted, right? Some adapt to the new technology, but many find themselves without purpose. Like nobody needs a newspaper anymore to consume information, like the physical newspaper. And so the pulp and paper industry gets disrupted. And there's so many elements that get wiped away when a technological revolution takes place. Kodak, nobody needs film or cameras. The camera is now embedded in the phone, and the film is just RAM. It's just memory. So the incumbents get left behind, and nobody needs a central bank when everybody's using Bitcoin. Nobody really needs a bank when everybody's using Bitcoin. Nobody needs regulators to tell us how to regulate the banks when nobody's using banks. So Bitcoin disintermediates, digitizes, revolutionizes a lot of the infrastructure that's behind the modern form of money. And I expect the same thing will happen. Like you can already see it with people who are living a very Bitcoin lifestyle. They are either people who don't have access to banking. So, and this is another common feature of disruptive technology. They first serve the people who are overserved and unable to be served by the incumbent technology, right? It's all the people who are unbanked who can see the real currency advantages of Bitcoin. And so all the people who don't have good store of value, who are using Bitcoin as a store of value. So we've got two very different worlds developing in Bitcoin, but in both cases, it's serving people who recognize that it's a better alternative to an alternative that they maybe didn't even have in the first instance. And then as something grows, then it starts to serve the customers of the incumbents, right? And so now we've actually got the big institutions taking note, like BlackRock's got an ETF, right? They've taken note that people want to invest in Bitcoin, and now they're starting to offer the service and get involved in it. So Bitcoin's beyond that serving the overserved market, and it's now serving the market that's highly competitive, but it's still very early days. The ETFs are not even a year old at the time that we're having this conversation, and they're still relatively small compared to the entire investment, the total addressable market, as people refer to it, of what Bitcoin is. So we're following a typical revolutionary, disruptive adoption curve, but because the total addressable market is so big and so incumbent and so regulated and slow, this is a slower march than like the launch of the iPhone. And this is going to take decades to completely work its way through the system, but it's got this constant forward momentum like a ratchet. Every now and then it takes a quantum leap forward, and nobody can move it back from where it is.
That's super interesting. And it's also interesting that we're talking about how Bitcoin makes governments smaller or maybe even disappear. And now governments are buying Bitcoin. so that's a super interesting connection there.
Really early into that, right? Like there may be a couple of odd governments, but now we've got the United States government saying that they want to have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. At the time that we're recording, they're not sure how much Bitcoin they have. They're not sure how they're going to acquire it, but they're interested in it. And this may be a fleeting idea, or it may be the beginning of a very big idea, and it's going to start to take root. So nobody knows exactly how fast it's going to play out or how slow it'll play out. I think that's one of the interesting things. There's a lot of people speculating on it and getting disappointed when it doesn't play out as fast as they hoped, and vice versa. But it's like the awareness of this thing, that it actually can work as money and that it isn't just a crazy idea, is evolving, and it becomes like the more people who think it's not crazy, the more not crazy it actually becomes.
It will get normalized. I think like if you mention Bitcoin, like in 2012, people said like, "Oh, what is Bitcoin?" Right. Then like somewhere, if you mention it, I don't know, 2016, 2017, people are like, "Oh, it's a pyramid scheme," or something like that, depending on where you are. And now it's really hard to say that Bitcoin is a pyramid scheme when it's getting so normalized. Big institutions, big governments, big companies are buying it. It's kind of like getting normalized from everything. And that's an interesting adoption curve that is already happening.
Yes. Yeah. And I think so many of these large financial institutional ideas can be deemed as pyramid schemes, like the Social Security, the national pension plans, right? The young people pay in, the old people take out. And the idea wasn't that they'd be a pyramid scheme. The idea was, well, the economy will grow and new young people will come in and pay the people who are young now when they're old. And ideally, everything would have been fully funded. But even if it isn't, there's this sense of that there's this rolling funding of it. So it's not just a pyramid scheme. It's a self-sustaining ongoing process, like something that's alive, right? But it turns out that's really problematic in a fiat world. And when people catch on to the game of fiat, that's when it really gets tough. And so now we're at a moment in history where young people can't even afford to pay for their own living, let alone pay for the retirement of old people. And old people have sucked a lot of the money out of the system already. So we have this funding dilemma. And if you paint Bitcoin as something that it's a retirement, it's a replacement for your retirement savings. So you look at it as this long-term store of value solution. It too, if it didn't fix society, if it didn't fix civilization and make it possible for young people to save their money and earn what they want to and spend on their lives, then it would, in fact, ultimately, at least as a store of value, be some kind of pyramid scheme. Like, let's get young people to buy it so old people can live nicely, who had more money to buy Bitcoin in the first place, who had more fiat money to buy Bitcoin in the first place. So, but I think it's much, much more than just an investment and an alternative to the pension schemes that are now failing us. It's actually a fix for society, because you don't have the redistributive effects, which are political in their nature, that steal from the hardworking and give to the not working, which ultimately has hollowed out at least Western civilization. It's been one of the biggest breakdowns in terms of what made Western civilization so productive and so successful. The more people who have become parasites on the economy, in a sense, right, or who aren't able to contribute but end up receiving from those who do contribute, end up weakening the civilization and the economy. And then you end up with these big disparities of those who have taking from those who have not already, and those who have not then just giving up on the game and not believing in the civilization any longer.
That's my big hope for Bitcoin, that this proof of work mentality comes back in society, that you're like, okay, if you want something, then you have to do something for that.
Proof of work combined with the scarcity is the fundamental game changer here, right? Like the problem with 5 decades of true fiat money is money is conjured up out of thin air for people with political pull. And then there's no nice way to say that. And there's no point in trying to paint it more nicely. And everyone grows up by and large being told, work hard, study hard, work hard, and you'll earn money and you'll succeed. And that ought to be, and that makes perfect sense, because it's like, if you produce a lot of stuff, you're creating value for the world, and the world will pay you for your value. But there's something glitched in the system, which is that what you get paid with has a loophole, and certain people have access to that loophole, and they're abusing that loophole to extraordinary degree, right? Like the amount of fiat money that's printed and distributed to to people with political favor is off the charts, right? We've got a $35 trillion deficit, trillions of dollars get printed here and there. Government contracts are awarded left, right, and center. And the attempt, we've got Elon Musk now trying to fix it in the United States with his Department of Government Efficiency. But what if we didn't have corruption? What if the money wasn't corruptible in the first place? Like, how did all the money get misspent? Well, it had to be in the hands of people who could misspend it. And how do people who misspend money end up with so much money? Well, because they have access to this thing called the money printer. They can conjure it out of thin air. They haven't earned it. They haven't, people haven't surrendered it to them voluntarily. They haven't even surrendered it to them involuntarily through taxation. It's been manufactured out of thin air through a money printer on top of that. And that's the dilemma that makes the world so unfair for people who want to have a work ethic and contribute to the civilization.
When you listen to, and I listened to the podcast from Elon Musk, I think on Joe Rogan, where he talked about Doge and the things that he found, and it kind of like what? There's it's a lot more than I thought, and a lot more nonsensical than I thought.
Right. It is. Yeah. I guess the older you are, the less nonsensical you find it, because you've seen all these scandals come and go, and you just see that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Right. And I think this is the problem, that you can't rein in government from within government. You have a president like Ronald Reagan, and now you have the current Trump administration, who make some effort. But when you actually step back and look at it, it's like if you've got a garden that's filled with weeds of all different kinds, and they keep spreading and growing, and you decide to make an effort now, after 50 years of weeds growing, to pull all the weeds, they're going to grow faster than you can pull them. And there's going to be so many in so many places, and they cast their seeds so wide. I think that that's really what's become of our government. Like there's more departments and you can count. They have more employees and you can count. They can't keep count of their expenses. And there's been such a sloppiness in the quality of decision making that they're making, including the decision makers that they've hired, that people don't even know what's going on anymore. And so you need to fix the system from outside the system. And that's really what Bitcoin is doing. As more and more people recognize that Bitcoin is honest, justified, like just money, not only money, but money that is just. They put more and more of their value into it. They store more and more of their value into it. Again, we're really early, but As they do that, they they take the resources away from all this misspending, from all these weeds, if we stick with that garden metaphor. And so only genuine, honest money can grow in value. And if you lose your Bitcoin, you've made bad decisions, and it ends up in the hands of people who make good decisions, right, with respect to money, rather than there's some money printer of Bitcoin that some bureaucrats get to keep making more and more and more of each year. And every time they spend all their money, they vote themselves a increase to the debt ceiling so that they can create more. Like that's what's being closed off. And that's all we need to close off to fix our society. It's going to be slow. It's going to be long, but it's going to fix this problem without a revolution, to restore us with a new government that would ultimately just restart the same problem that we have right now, right? We need to take the thing out of the hands of government. And this is, to quote Hayek, to paraphrase, this is that sly roundabout way to take the thing out of the hands of government.
That's the important part, yeah, true. Because I also see, like, even if you see the full potential of like what Doge, this department can do, the printing so much more money on the backside of it, it almost does not make any difference in the end. It's great that they put the efforts, but it's a system that's broken, and not small players in there. How do you think what is the implications of that if governments long term cannot no longer print money because it's basically has no value, and we are moving more towards a Bitcoin standard? What will that do to civilization and also governments?
Yeah, it'll make for a smaller government civilization, right? I think we got caught up in a lot of the socialist ideas, which is if government can provide education, and government can provide healthcare, and government can provide the roads, and government can provide oversight of nutrition and food and agriculture, and government can provide oversight of medication and drugs, and government, and the list goes on and on and on and on. You end up with this single monopoly that doesn't have to be profitable in terms of delivering value, because it's not generating any revenue from its customers. It's printing money and taxing the taxpayer, and the quality, the diversity of offerings diminishes. The innovation within the offerings diminishes because there's no real competition, and the quality of service diminishes because you don't have the customer having the ability to say, I don't like the quality, so I'm not paying for it. And so you have no market mechanism in so many of the most important industries of our civilization. Bitcoin fixes that by choking off the thing that's substituting free markets. And so I think we'll end up seeing a world with a lot more diversity of offerings in these areas. There won't be consensus, but it won't be like right now we have a consensus about how to educate everybody, and it's wrong. Like, we're putting out dumber and dumber people who are more and more indoctrinated and less capable of critical thought. And they're all subject to the same system that's failing them all. Right? So we may not end up with I don't think we'll end up with a perfect system. What we'll end up with is a system that keeps getting better through the nature of competition. People will say, oh, my kid's not getting a good education at this school. I'll move them to another school that looks like it's doing a better job. Or I don't like this approach to teaching. I'll choose to purchase a different approach to teaching for myself or my kids. And so we'll start to get more diversity, more choice. Some choices will be right for some people and wrong for other people. So people will be able to make the choice that's right for them. And that's what's going to happen across the board. We'll give up on this idea of everything should be provided by the government because it's so important that it needs to be an essential service. And we'll take an awful version of it for everybody universally so that we can say that everybody's getting it. But that's a big part of the awakening of civilization right now, that our attempt to provide everybody with everything universally and homogeneously hasn't worked out. Like we have to come to that realization and admit that it didn't work. And maybe we don't even have to admit that it didn't work. It just has to stop working to the point where people start choosing private alternatives. But there's still a big political tension over those issues. Like if you surveyed the population in various countries, you'd find, I'm making this up, but it's kind of my intuition, at least 40% of people, and probably as much as 90% of people, believe the government should provide public education to everybody. Right? So it's like a long way to go before the government stops doing it, or people believe that the government ought to stop doing it in large numbers.
Well, you mentioned awakening. Is that something bigger than Bitcoin? Is that something like
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's like Bitcoin plays a really interesting part in this general awakening towards we've let the pendulum swing far too far in the direction of government, of the size of government and the mandate of government. There is a broad awakening taking place, but Bitcoin gives firmament to that awakening. You know, like before Bitcoin, you might have said, well, you know, government's too big, but what can I do about it? I can go and protest. You know, don't make government smaller, but that doesn't do anything. And if enough people protest, then the government shows up with hoses and washes everyone's way. And some nations, they show up with bullets and they shoot everyone away. And it takes a lot, and like the stamina to protest and to make effective change is really, you know, it's limited. Like, how long can you stand in a protest for? A few weeks, you know, a month? Like I live in Canada. People were protesting the COVID vaccine mandates, and the government declared a state of emergency, cleaned them all out, arrested them, froze their bank accounts. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is a form of protest, right? It's a protest against the fiat nature of the world. But you don't have to go somewhere with a picket sign to protest. You run a node in your house somewhere, or someplace else. You keep your cold storage keys someplace. And so the government, you're not concentrating all the people tired and hungry in front of the government building so that they can come with the hose and wash you away. If the government wants to stop Bitcoin, they have to go to each and every house of each and every person who has a node and stop it. And it doesn't really stop it, because each and every person outside of the government's jurisdiction who's running Bitcoin keeps the entire system running. So it's a form of protest that the government can't stop, and doesn't have this. And they're the ones who now have to have the stamina, right? Like, Bitcoin keeps on running. So like, how many weeks, how many months of energy is the government prepared to put in fighting Bitcoin? Ultimately, they all concede it's not worth fighting. Some might even go so far as, well, we can't beat them, so we'll join them. But I think governments around the world tend to realize, after some effort, that they didn't manage to stop Bitcoin. And most of them just forget about it and move on, because they forget about it because they've got some other big scandal that they're dealing with, or some other big program that they're trying to fund. But Bitcoin, just as a protest, keeps growing and growing and growing, and never stops. It's like a block every 10 minutes. It keeps on going. Each block represents energy into the protest movement.
Is that the governments you said, like they can ignore it, they can fight it, they can join it? Where are we there right now? It seems like we're already maybe in the joining part, but I don't know how much you really understand it, or do you just want to get voters at that point?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin's a really hard thing to understand, and there's so many facets of it that you can understand some facets and be completely ignorant or backwards on other facets and still see it one way or another. I do think, you know, we're at a point in history where a very large part of the world's governments are no longer fighting it. Right, the fighting stage is coming to an end, and in particular, with some nations joining it, other nations are going to quickly have to realize that there's no point in fighting it, or they'll get left behind. And some nations will fight it and get left behind. This is just, you know, inevitable, right? It's not everyone. The game theorists say, oh, everybody's rational, and they'll study it and they'll understand it and they'll recognize that they need to get into it as fast as they possibly can before everybody else does. So we'll have a hyper Bitcoinization moment. I don't think that's right. Not because the theory doesn't have a consistent logic, but that the theory doesn't correspond to the behavior of individuals, which is individuals, particularly in governments, are not rational. They're self-interest, or they're not rational in an objective sense of actually serving the purpose of the government, or being of the people, or of being smart, right? They're self-interested. They have a million different things to focus on. Understanding Bitcoin's hard, so many of them will misunderstand it, misclassify it, and be uninterested in it or opposed to it, even while other nations and other companies are accumulating it. And that's the breakaway opportunity for those who do become enlightened sooner rather than later. It is interesting how this has been a very bottoms up adoption for Bitcoin, right? From people who do understand cryptography and monetary theory and Austrian economics, then to people who are affected by inflation, you know, and to people who lack banking facilities, to now corporations with treasury strategies and potentially governments with strategies for treasury strategies as well, but on a national level.
Let's take a break for a moment and appreciate the beauty that Coin Vigilante has made with the Bitcoin watches. Those watches are the most amazing, the most elegant way of showing that you are a true Bitcoiner. And Coin Vigilante just dropped a completely new and amazing Genesis edition of their watch collections. You have the date of the first ever mined Bitcoin block in there, and of course also the block height and which epoch we are currently in. I love the level of detail they put in this masterpiece. Make sure to check out those amazing Coin Vigilante timepieces down in the descriptions. I love those watches so much. And now if you have Bitcoin, I really do hope that you don't have it on exchange. But if you do have it on exchange, I have two ways for you to deal with that. The first way is you put it on a hardware wallet. That's the entry for you to get into the self-custody game. I recommend BitBox, Bitcoin only edition for that. It's a super simple and secure way. And if you check out the link in the description, you even get 5% off if you use the code Robin. And the second way is the Bitcoin Way. The Bitcoin Way is your all-in partner in terms of how to get the most out of your sovereignty. They will personalize for you a self-custody setup that is perfect for your individual situation. They will show you how you can secure your own devices. Securing your Bitcoin is not enough. You also have to keep all your devices secure. One topic that is overlooked often is the inheritance plan. What happens with your Bitcoin once you are no longer here? Do you have a plan for that in place already? And last but not least, if you're in the jurisdictions where you don't feel safe, it's better to get a plan B. For all that, head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin to get a 30-minute free call. And just a quick side note, I will be for the first time ever speaking at the Bitcoin Prague event in June. It will be absolutely legendary and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you there. You can get your ticket in the link down in the description of Bitcoin Prague, and very important, use code Robin to get 10% off your ticket. I'm really looking forward seeing you there. What do you think is the mental barrier that I mean, there's like nation states, there's companies, there's individuals, but even like nation states and companies is just a group of people in the end of the day, and there's group that are people that make decisions. So for me, it's always back to the individual that has kind of the barrier to understand Bitcoin. Yeah. And I can fully understand why you don't get Bitcoin in 2013, but in 2025 we come to a point where the education and materials, the resources, and also the proof that Bitcoin already went through those 16 years of running and surviving so many attacks. It gets so obvious if you actually look a little bit deeper. What's the mental barrier for people, for 99% of people?
I mean, in the worst case, there are people who the mental barrier is one of, like you can't get someone to understand something that they're paid to not understand. The famous quote by, I think, Mark Twain, but it might be somebody else. But it's like, if you're running the European Central Bank, you're not going to give a fair hearing to Bitcoin, right? And you're like, but you love the idea of a CBDC, even though when you hear the words you speak, it sounds like the most evil invention anyone could come up with, and you're promoting the deployment of an evil invention that will take rights away from people, freedom away from people, the opportunity to escape away from people. And so, like, you hear the central bankers speak, and they sound like villains to not just to Bitcoiners, they sound like villains to anyone who believes that people should be free. And yet their mental block is, well, my incentives, my paycheck, my duties are to preserve this entity that does this thing that I've been told is good. And so, at some point you realize you're the bad guy, but it's a very long way. And people who tend to go work for that thing are not people who are deeply analytical about the problems and flaws with it, right? But people who rise up through that system and recognize its flaws, leave it rather than get promoted to the very top of it. So I think in a lot of these structures that are very powerful and very incumbent, it's very hard for individuals who are enlightened about these changes to rise to the top of them. And so it's not actually obvious, right? Like the head of the World Bank is not, it does not see it as obvious that Bitcoin's coming and then chooses to do something evil to stop it. They're annoyed by this thing. They're bothered by it. It seems evil to them because they're on a mission to do good. And this is disrupting their ability to try to do what they're doing. They're not doing a very objective analysis of how much good or bad they've done in the last 30 years. They just think it's the only thing to do, right? Like we're the institution charged with this mandate, and we're using the tools at our disposal to achieve our mandate. And they don't work perfect, but it's the best thing we've got is what they think. And if someone says, well, here's Bitcoin, an alternative, they're like, well, it doesn't even have the options we have. Like, we can at least raise interest rates and lower interest rates. We can print money and not print. We can ease money and tighten money. What Bitcoin has no choices. It's just got this fixed monetary policy. How is that a fix? And it is, but they don't see it, right? Like, they don't see that the problem is that they're playing games with the interest rates and the money supply, and that Bitcoin isn't, and that's what the fix is, taking away the limited tools that they have.
I think there are two really interesting things in there. I think like the rules without rulers, a lot of people have a problem with that. I think there's a large group of people, and even when I speak with some people outside of Bitcoin, or like friends of friends, when you come to like bigger gatherings, people really want to have something above them that gives them guidance and like brings them security and those things. And like the concept of having rules that are set in place, but there's no one to actually rule those rules. Yeah. Like the rulers are missing. A lot of people have really big mental barriers with that.
Yeah, we've grown up in a world where we've been told that there are benevolent rulers, and if they're malevolent, we can vote them out, so we don't have to worry, and we should just accept rulers. Nature is different, right? Nature has rules, and nobody can change them, and nobody can violate them. Right? The laws of nature are inviolable and unchangeable, and you can learn the laws of nature and use them in more creative ways. That's what invention and science really are all about. And nobody seems to have a problem with that. Like nobody's shaking their fist in the air and saying, "Why does gravity exist?" Like I want to change the laws of gravity. But everyone's petitioning in the streets. I want to change this law and I want to change that law, the man-made laws. And so there is an enlightenment and an acceptance of reality. And so much of this attempt to get benevolent rulers to do perfect things is rested upon what I would argue is a very flawed notion that you can achieve perfection or utopia, right? That if we just meddle enough in every single thing, we'll create a perfect society with no crime, bright people, abundant wealth. And the truth is, the reality of it is uglier, right? Like you're not going to have one genius at the top saying, you do this, you do that, you do this to like 7 billion people, and being right for each and every one of them, and right for the whole collectively. And this is why free markets are the best solution that we're aware of, because people try to do what they think is good for a group of people who they think it's good for. And if that group of people thinks it's good for them, then they pay them for it. But if they don't pay them for it. And that person learns a lesson that they had a wrong idea, and they move on to another idea that's right. They don't just have an infinite money printer from, I wanted to do this, and now, 30 years later, my descendants continue to do this, but it's not benefiting anybody anymore. So we need to allow failures in the system. We need to allow death in the system of bad ideas. And we need to allow innovation of the existing ideas so that they can get better. And that's what free markets allow for. And the idea of a ruler is an idea of not a free market, right? Especially when you talk about it at a government level. You're someone who's saying, I'm choosing for others, right? So people don't get the free choice. They are required to go along with what I have decided for them. And that's the fundamental flaw. And people keep You know, they're like, okay, well, this last guy didn't deliver his promises, so I'm voting him out and voting the new guy. He's got a great set of promises and he says everything's going to go good. And then that doesn't work out. So we vote him out and vote the next guy in. And we're just on this ridiculous treadmill of insanity. You know, people who say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. It really feels like that's what's become of democracy, right? We keep voting out the last asshole to vote in the new guy who promises to be amazing and turns out to be an asshole. To repeat the cycle over and over and over and over again. And by the time you get to be my age, you realize, gee, we've been doing this. You know, we've elected like 10 leaders in my time here, and the pattern seems to be forming that we don't like any of them after a few years.
I still have hope, but probably just because I'm young.
Yeah. Well, you become jaded against. I mean, I have lots of hope thanks to Bitcoin, right? I've become jaded about democracy. I've lost my faith in it. I think it's gotten much worse, in fact, in the time that I've been alive. But I have hope because of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin lets us opt out of choosing who's going to fuck us, right? You know, like choosing whose lies we're going to believe as promises that are going to be unfulfilled. And like Bitcoin makes promises and it keeps every one of them.
Absolutely. And the one thing I never get about socialist system, it's a very arrogant thing to say. It's like, oh, I want to design a socialist system because I know how the world works better. And I know what people really want. And because in socialist system, we always have to decide centrally on matters, basically. And then it's like, do you really know? Like how do you decide all those small points and details and figure out the pricing things?
I hired an army of bureaucrats and told them to decide on my behalf for you. It's like, how about you don't hire anybody and let me decide on my behalf for me? Like, what a radical idea if we don't have an army of bureaucrats meddling in every single person's life, who don't know their names, who don't care about them, who care about themselves instead. It's like, it just seems so obvious once you live through it for long enough that this doesn't work. And yet it's not obvious to the people who are executing the instructions of the socialist bureaucracy, of the centralized bureaucracy. It's a startling phenomenon. It's and history will look back at this stage of civilization and say, didn't it seem obvious to them, at least after some period of time, that this thing wasn't working? Like, why did they keep trying it over and over and over again? But that'll be at a point in history when we've accepted that that being ruled is not the nature of a human being, that a human being needs to rule themselves. You know, you need to be your own ruler. You need to be sovereign. But we're so far away from that, right? Like, it's not what's taught in the schools. So you have to be sovereign enough to discover that you can and should be sovereign.
How much should Bitcoiners care about what's going on with local politics? Like, I don't know, in your state politicians, your local politicians in your town?
I don't know. I think Bitcoiners are becoming much more diversified in their priorities and interests. You know, you've got OG type cypherpunks. You've got people who are in it to preserve their wealth. You've got people who are in it for its political impact. And so I think it's like as a voting block. Interestingly enough, if we refer, even though I can say we should not be voting, right? But maybe we should be voting government out or voting minarchists in. As a voting block, it's a very diversified group, and Bitcoiners they seem to be on a constant learning journey. So if you take any one Bitcoiner at 2 points in time, their views are much more evolved, nuanced, adapted, or focused on current issues that are different than they used to be at those 2 different points in time. Like the Bitcoin journey is a journey of growth, and for some people, maybe it's not that much. It's like, oh, I heard there were 21 million, so it's a good store of value, and I bought some and I forgot about it. That may be the case for some of them, but for many Bitcoiners, this is a revolution. This is a movement. This is something that they're learning more and more about, and they're getting involved in everything. Sometimes it's kind of laughable, right? Like the whole Bitcoin movement will become experts on whatever the current thing is in news media. You know, so they'll become constitutional experts. They'll become experts on UFOs. They'll become experts on diets and on medications. But on the whole, it's still quite interesting to see this is what sovereign education looks like. It's not you learned everything you needed to from the time you were 6 to the time you were 18, and now you don't need to learn anymore. It's actually what's going on right now. How do I learn about it? And what's my view on what ought to be the case, what we ought to do, and whether or not government should or shouldn't be involved, and Bitcoin fixes it or not. Like, I think that's part of what's really interesting about this movement. It's a self-educated, ongoing education movement, and so that also speaks to why it's so anti-fragile, right? The people who want rulers and want to be ruled and want to select their rulers through voting have the same answer to all the new problems. Like, there's a new problem. Oh, well, what's a politician? What are the two politicians who are running for office say that they're each going to do? And I'm going to pick one of the two solutions that somebody else has come up with, rather than let's take a look at the problem. Let's try to understand it. What are the different options of fixes? Which one am I going to choose for myself, and why? Right? That's so fundamentally different. Which one's going to win the popularity contest and be the solution for everybody out of a choice of two, when there's a universe of 100 choices, or unlimited choices in reality.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you are forced in America. I mean, in Austria and other countries, I don't know how it's actually in Canada. You have at least like 3 or 4, sometimes 5 different parties where it's at least like a little bit of more diverse choice. But a 2-party system is like, wow, like it seems to be like, or it's like left or right, and there's like 50 solutions in between there that's not even discussed. But at least
further left and right, or like on a completely different tangent. Yeah, so I think this is the, I used to be a very, very staunch advocate for, believer of democracy, even as an imperfect system, right? Like, I didn't think democracy was perfect, but as Winston Churchill said, it's the worst system except for all the others. And I've come around to the view that no, there's a better system, right? Bitcoin is the better system, the system that guarantees inviolable sovereignty to each individual by establishing rules that can't be changed, that can't be compromised upon, and that are just to begin with. And once you have that, and you're able to use energy and cryptography to secure those rules and make them inviolable, you've got a better system. And that's what the world is slowly learning.
Interesting. Are you then also not voting because you don't see the system because you don't want to give the energy?
Listen, we're going to have an election here, and I'm going to vote because I want to throw the last asshole out and bring the next asshole in. And I'm an asshole, but he's not as bad an asshole as the guy who's the incumbent. So I will vote, but I'm not. But I don't have hopes that this fixes everything. Like, I'm not selling I'm not voting, and if the right guy wins, I'm selling all my Bitcoin and putting all my faith in him. I'm not selling my Bitcoin under any circumstances, and I'm hoping that this one asshole is a little bit, offset some of the really assholey things that the last guy did. So that's the extent of my participation of my expectation of the democratic process as it is right now. That things are so broken that's the most hopeful I can be. I wish I could be more hopeful, but it's really broken.
Absolutely. I have the approach, and usually, we have 5 parties in Austria, and except for one, I actually already voted for all of them in my short life. And I usually go with like, now I go always with since like 1-2 years, I always go with that party that argues for less government, that argues for like, we want to cut spending. We want to as soon as you speak about like hiring taxes and like where can we spend more, then it's like, I don't want to do it.
That's like the amazing thing is that they're never satisfied that they have enough of your money. Like, the government's never satisfied that it's big enough. The income tax has to go up. The capital gains tax has to go up. The sales tax has to go up. All these peripheral carbon taxes and cigarette taxes and liquor taxes and drug taxes, and all these taxes go up. And then they print money on top of that. And then they deficit spend on top of that. And so they're pushing 100% of GDP plus, and the productivity of our countries keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So they feel, we need to print more money in order to offset for the productivity losses. But they don't realize that the printing money is the cause of the productivity losses. People get paid more to beg for money from the government than they get if they try to earn money, and the government takes it all away from them through taxation and inflation. So like this is the biggest problem. And there's no one in the government with a true incentive to cut the size of government dramatically. Like as much as Donald Trump and Elon Musk are talking about it, the size of the government in the United States is so big that you don't even know where to begin. And you can begin at some place, but you're not going. It's like trying to take a little lawnmower and mow a gigantic, a 300-acre farm with it. It's just you're going to get exhausted before you've made a dent.
Yeah, it's like you have a huge football field and you're trying to cut the grass with like a nail scissor.
Exactly. Oh, that's how big it's gotten. That's how out of control it is, and that's why you need something revolutionary to disrupt it and replace it.
Is there a place for a centralized planned government in a Bitcoin world?
There's room for a government, Bitcoin rules the digital realm, and we tap into the digital realm for money and information right now. But the physical realm, Bitcoin doesn't rule, So like if you and I were in the same room and I came and I punched you in the face, Bitcoin doesn't fix that, right? So we still need to have some mechanism that retaliates against force that's initiated, irrationally or unjustifiably by a first party. And that's what we need government to do. And it can be structured in different ways. It doesn't, it can be militias, it can be, but like we need some judges, we need some police, right? We need some laws that say, if you do this, that consequence will be imposed upon you. And it needs to be down to earth and rational. Not all of these, we have so many laws on the books that, we need an AI system now to read them and understand them and interpret them, because no lawyer or judge can. And it's such a slow process to go through the courts because everything's so backlogged, because all the laws are so complicated, and there's so many perceived violations, which may or may not be things that we actually need the law for. So I believe in a very small government because we need something to prevent disorder and chaos of there being no rules around violence, but and theft. But that's what we need the government to do, to protect people from violence and theft, not to build the roads and provide the education and administer all the doctors and nurses and hospitals and drugs and pharmaceutical companies and banks and all that kind of stuff. We need them to be there to help mitigate force and fraud, initiation of force and the use of fraud.
Funny enough, this is currently actually a topic in Austria, because we have right now, we have since 16 years a corruption case against the previous minister of finance. And it's just going on since 16 years. And now it seems like in the next week, there's finally a decision if he actually was doing something wrongful as a politician or not. And it's going on for 16 years. And there's doesn't even make sense to accuse him of anything after 16 years of the process going on. So there's...
Isn't that interesting? I just point out that Bitcoin is 16 years old. So here's what one court has not managed to do in 16 years versus here's what one peer-to-peer system has managed to do in 16 years. The number of people affected, the amount of justice that's been dealt by Bitcoin versus the amount of justice that's been dealt by the courts. I also I like to think back. The people who knew the Bitcoin system knew that Craig Wright was a fraud the day that he announced that he was Satoshi, right? Like we said, where's the signature? Publish the public signature on the Genesis block or a known Satoshi block, or get the fuck out. The fact that you didn't do it proves to us that you can't prove that you're Satoshi, which means you're not Satoshi if you're claiming to be Satoshi and providing proof, right? Pretty straightforward logic. And we knew it the day of, and it took until late last year for the court system to get through, and multiple court cases, and he was suing people, and he was costing a fortune and misleading tons of people, and lots of people lost their money on it, going through the court system. So there's something, when I say Bitcoin is a system of justice, it's a just system, there's a lot of adjudication and judgment that goes into Bitcoin. Every block that goes through, every single node runner judges every single transaction and the proof of work on that block, right? So there's not a single, you cannot act with injustice in Bitcoin. You cannot spend coins that have been spent. You cannot spend coins that aren't yours. You can't earn a coin that you haven't done the proof of work on. End of story. You can't do it, right? Forget you do it, and then some judge, somebody has to sue you to try to undo the damage that you did. You cannot do the damage. So it's a system that prevents violation of its rules, and so you don't need to go to court to say, this person double spent a coin. It's like, no, there's no such thing as double spending. It's impossible to double spend. End of story. Game
Absolutely.
over.
Yeah, and it's like it was so fun for me because it was like like the thinking of there is a guy that makes so much efforts, or a guy, a girl, a group of people to stay anonymous, and then he tries to prove in court that he is that.
There's so many layers of phosphorousness around the Craig Wright story for sure. But yeah, Satoshi can prove that he's Satoshi. Right? Just like I can prove that I control the private keys to the coin, the UTXOs, that I actually do control the private keys to. And I can't prove that the other way. So I may choose to keep it a secret, but if I want to come out and say, I have one whole Bitcoin, I can prove it to somebody, right? Like, I can prove it to a bank. I can prove it to the press. I can prove it to anybody else. Or if I can't, then it's safe to assume that I don't. Right? Like if I'm trying to prove something and I can't prove it in a system where proof is easy, then I'm trying to make a false claim. And you can take that.
And I think the Satoshi ship has sailed. I think we will probably never know who it is.
Yeah, that's my view too.
It's like if we got to know, I think we probably would already know. Like it's too long. Like 16 years. It's just like it's too long of a period.
We're quite obsessed with trying to figure out who Satoshi is, and it's kind of and many Bitcoiners push back on them and say, like, the only thing Satoshi really asked for is to leave him alone, right? He didn't ask for the money. He didn't ask for power. He didn't ask for fame. He disappeared, quite consciously. He didn't leave clues and say, if you want to find me, here, like, he tried to hide as many clues. He wanted to be left alone. So people who are obsessed with trying to find him are actually doing a disrespectful thing. And they're welcome to do it, right? Bitcoin doesn't care what you do. It's a permissionless system. You can do it, but to the extent that you honor Satoshi and you're grateful for the gift that he gave to the world in Bitcoin, maybe we should just leave it alone. Not that I think they're going to find out who it is, but I think it's something that whenever I see somebody like concocting some theory like Jack Dorsey is, or somebody else is, it's like, leave Jack Dorsey alone, and for God's sake, leave Satoshi alone. Like he gave you this, deal with it rather than try to figure out who he was against his wishes.
Yeah, this is also something that I really don't like, when we try to put the Satoshi thing on a living person. So like Jack Dorsey, or like I forgot his name of the documentary series. Peter Todd, exactly. It's like, because this puts a burden actually on a actual
when people
being.
say it was Hal Finney or Len Sassaman, that puts a pressure on Hal Finney's wife, or on his legacy, or on Len Sassaman's family. Like, you know what? You don't know who Satoshi is. It's meant to be that way. It's a big part of the honor within the system that the creator didn't take credit for it, or put himself on a pedestal as the ruler. Right? We have no ruler because Satoshi, nobody knows who he is, and he doesn't exist anymore. Satoshi is like it's like a persona, right? It's like Superman, and he wore a mask and nobody knew who he was in real life. And that's the way it was meant to be. And he's retired now because he did the good deed that he was meant to do, the super achievement that nobody else could have done beforehand in a superb way. So I say, just leave it be. And that's another one of these, to come back to the beginning of this conversation, that's another very spiritual thing about Bitcoin.
And I think do you think Bitcoin would have been successful if, since like day one, we would have known who Satoshi Nakamoto is and is a real person that goes on podcasts and stuff like that?
No, I really think that for a few reasons. One is the pressure that individual would have been subject to, had it gone towards any level of success that we've seen, would have caused some chaos in the system, right? Like we need him to change the system. People would have directed their attention and focus on him rather than on the system because he is in control. So we would have been rules with a ruler. Right. I think that's just unavoidable as opposed to rules without a ruler. And we've got to figure out how to manage the system together collectively as a whole. So I think it would have been very, very different. Even if he was still around and still pseudonymous, it would have been very different. So the creation of Bitcoin required the disappearance of Satoshi to become the entity that it is. And I think Satoshi knew that. Right. I don't think he ran away just out of fear and had intended to stay involved for a long time. He had been prepared to cut the cord at any moment in time, probably in part because he was scared of being persecuted. But he knew that he would need to do this at the time that he announced it even. Right. So it was always part of the plan.
Absolutely. Sometimes I wonder like how much he foresaw in the Bitcoin adoption would be. I think that's where the obsession comes from, because people are thinking of like, what if I could ask that person question and stuff like that, and they're obsessing with that. And I get the curiosity around that.
I understand the curiosity and the hero worship, right? Like, I mean, what this man did was unprecedented in so many different respects, in the field of computer science, in the field of economics, in the field of government, in the field of altruism, right? Like he didn't do this for his own sake and his own benefit to his own enrichment. He gave a gift to the world and took nothing, asked nothing in return other than to leave him alone.
Absolutely. I have one question that I asked each and every one of my guests, and the question is, what can we learn from you besides Bitcoin?
Well, it depends on how much time you spend with me, but the thing that is outside of Bitcoin that I think Bitcoin has shown me is like the greatest treasure in the world is figuring out who you are and what you love and realizing that. And I think Bitcoin empowers a journey that lets people go on that path to discover their true self, and that's ultimately the greatest prize that you can have. You can have a ton of money and then look to influencers as to what watch you should buy, what yacht you should buy, what car you should buy. But there's a lot more to you than that. And it's unique to you. Right now, I don't have the answer for you, and you don't have the answer for me. It comes from living our lives and introspecting and experimenting, and ultimately being sovereign with your limited time on Earth. And so, to me, I think that's the greatest lesson that I encourage people to go on them to learn for themselves. Like, who are you? And what really are you? Test yourself in all sorts of different ways. See what you're capable of. See what your limits are. See what your passions are, what you truly love, and find a way to live the best life you can for you.
That's beautiful. I like that a lot. It's really cool. We have end routine in the podcast where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you, what is wrong with Bitcoin today, which is holding us back?
Nothing. This is, the desire to come in and meddle with it is a misplaced desire, right? Like, which isn't to say that people ought not to make changes, to suggest changes to it. The process of thinking about Bitcoin and thinking about what could be better about it, but having to win over the vast majority of the community to the point where they will allow a change to be made to it is a great thing about Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is what it is. So there's nothing that I would say needs to change, even if I believe in some of the changes that are being proposed, right? The process to propose changes and make them take effect through socialization is exactly what a system with no rulers requires. So I think that I'm happy to go along this journey with Bitcoin at the pace that it's able to go, to the extent that I can help accelerate or broaden its reach. That's what I'm trying to do. But I accept Bitcoin. Like, there's a very Zen thing here, which is you better accept Bitcoin as it is, because if you try to resist what Bitcoin's nature is, you're going to find yourself banging your head against against a wall of encrypted energy, to use Michael Saylor's analogy, right? You're banging your head against a wall that is just way too powerful, and is headed in the right direction anyways. You just need to be patient about it.
Yeah, I think that's where those people who bang their heads against the wall are those who then go off and make the altcoins and try to make a better Bitcoin and improve a system that's already perfect. Yeah, that's good.
It's that thing. It's like, this is the nature. Like, if you want this decentralized system, accept its decentralization. Don't try to corrupt the most essential part of it for your own, folly, for your own egotistical, short-sighted desire.
Really cool. That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Thomas, for your time and being on. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Yeah, I spend a lot of my time on X. I'm also on Nostr, and my Nostr pub key is on my X pinned post, so at Tomer Strolight. If you want to read some of the stuff that I've written, there's two places where most of my writing is. One is tomerstrolight.medium.com. I wrote a lot of my Bitcoin philosophy on there. And then I was also the editor-in-chief of Swan. So if you go to swan.com/blog and you scroll down, you'll find lots of my articles and thoughts there. Those are longer pieces. I've made a couple of movies, again, on the Swan Bitcoin channel. You can find a movie called Bitcoin is Generational Wealth. It's about 15 minutes long. There's one called Bitcoin is Beautiful, which is only 6 or 7 minutes long. And then there's a bigger one that's 38 minutes long called The Legendary Treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto, which is my most widely read essay, and I guess my second most widely viewed video. I have two books. One's called Why Bitcoin, and again, you can find in my profile on Twitter a link to where you can order a hard copy of it, but you can get a free copy of this book at swan.com/whybitcoin, WHY And I've got a children's book called Satoshi Nakamoto and His Bitcoin Invention, which is for kids aged like 3 to 10, maybe as old as 3 to 12. And kids really love it. I've read it to a lot of kids, and I've seen parents read it to a lot of their kids, and tells the story of Bitcoin's creation and who Satoshi was, and and respects his privacy. It doesn't take a guess as to who he is. On Twitter, I do a weekly Spaces Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. Eastern called Bitcoin Philosophy Sundays, and we discuss a lot of the types of issues that you and I have discussed here, focusing on one issue per session. So those are all recorded. You can find them on my Twitter profile page, but you can also participate in them live. We welcome anyone to come and join the conversation if they feel they have something to add and want to participate in dialogue. That's probably enough.
Absolutely. There's a lot of Toma that you can go to and see now. Really cool. I appreciate it.
Bank of content for people to consume.
Excellent, really cool, and I always love. It's so fascinating for me to see the guests that have done the research, that not only putting the information into their heads, but also trying to put it out on content, being in film, written books, like whatever. It makes a huge difference if you actually wrote down something, actually made your head of like, okay, like how do I also present that what I just learned to other people? It's always a learning process.
Just sharing what you know, it's learning what you know. Right. And when you write, you discover what you actually think.
Yeah, that's a beautiful sentence. I love that. Really cool. Thank you so much, Thomas, for your time. Thank you so much also for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back tomorrow with another episode. Bye-bye.